As the applause for Isabella's engagement echoes through the ballroom, Adrian Blackwood makes a move that no one could have predicted. His voice cuts through the celebration like a thunderclap. "Miss Hawthorne is the only woman I've ever wanted as my Duchess." The gasps grow louder. Clara's heart pounds. What now? Is this truly love, or has the Duke made a mistake? Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. And trust me, you won't want to miss tomorrow's story, so stay tuned. England 1871, Hawthorne Manor in Hampshire. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting golden light through the glass panels of the conservatory. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly bloomed roses from the garden outside, weaving its way through the warm air. Clara Hawthorne, sitting alone in the corner of the small, sunlit room, let her fingers gently trace the edges of the medicinal herbs she had arranged on the table. Lavender, chamomile, and rosemary, simple plants, yet each one held the promise of relief and comfort for those in need. She took a deep breath, inhaling the earthy scent of the herbs, feeling a calm settle over her. The world outside, with its glittering ballrooms and social expectations, felt far away in this quiet sanctuary. Clara, with her plain chestnut hair pinned back in a modest knot, and her simple cream dress that fell just below her knees, had long accepted her place in life. She was the eldest daughter of the Hawthorne family, yet she had never been the one anyone sought after. Her younger sister, Isabella, was the star of every social gathering, with her golden curls and emerald green eyes that captured the attention of every gentleman in London. Clara wasn't bothered by it anymore. At 22, she had long since come to terms with her position. She would never be the one to dance under the chandelier at Lady Blackwood's grand balls, or be wooed by the Duke of Ravenswood. She was content to tend to the household's accounts, care for the sick in the village, and lose herself in the pages of a good book. The quiet of the conservatory was where she felt at peace, far from the noise and bustle of society's demands. Her peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp voice of Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Pemberton called, her footsteps growing louder as she approached the conservatory. "Your mother is looking for you. The Duke of Ravenswood has arrived, and your mother insists you come at once." Clara's fingers stilled over the lavender leaves. The Duke of Ravenswood? She had heard his name whispered around society, a wealthy and elusive man known for his reclusive nature. His return to London after several years abroad had caused a stir, and Lady Marguerite, her mother, had orchestrated every detail of their upcoming garden party with one goal in mind: Isabella's marriage prospects. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her voice now tinged with a note of urgency, "Lady Marguerite demands that you present yourself somewhat presentable. I shall assist you with your gown." Clara sighed softly. Her mother's expectations were clear. Isabella would be the jewel of the evening, and Clara would simply be there as a shadow, an accessory to her sister's beauty. Her role had long been set in stone, and she had accepted it without protest. She stood slowly, smoothing her plain dress as she walked toward the housekeeper. Somewhat presentable, she mused, knowing full well that her idea of presentable was vastly different from her mother's. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberton," Clara said quietly, her voice soft but resigned. "I will come at once." Inside the main house, the atmosphere was alive with excitement. Servants bustled about, making last-minute adjustments to the floral arrangements, while Lady Marguerite directed everything with an air of precision, her eyes flickering with anticipation. Isabella stood near the mirror, her golden curls carefully arranged, the sunlight catching in them like strands of silk. Her emerald gown shimmered as she twirled before the looking-glass, a vision of beauty and grace. "Clara," Lady Marguerite called out as soon as she saw her daughter enter the room, her voice sharp with impatience. "For heaven's sake, could you not have changed into something more fitting? The Duke of Ravenswood is here, and you will be presenting yourself as Isabella's companion for the evening." Clara winced inwardly at her mother's tone, but said nothing as she stepped further into the room. She had learned long ago that her mother's criticisms could never be avoided, only silently endured. Lady Marguerite's focus was entirely on Isabella, who had been groomed for this very moment. The society debutante, the perfect match for a man of noble title. The contrast between Clara and her sister was striking. While Isabella was poised and confident, radiating beauty as effortlessly as a flower blooms in the sun, Clara felt like an afterthought, a quiet presence in the background. Her chestnut hair, pinned simply into a knot at the back of her head, was nothing like her sister's perfect curls. Her plain lilac gown, devoid of any embellishments or jewelry, made her appear like a shadow in comparison to the extravagant gown Isabella wore. And it wasn't just her appearance that marked her difference, it was her place in the world. Clara had long since come to terms with being the plain sister. She would never capture the attention of men the way Isabella did. She would never be the one to make a match with a duke. At 22, Clara had resigned herself to a life of quiet duty. While Isabella dazzled in the ballrooms and charmed the guests with her beauty and social grace, Clara found solace in tending to the sick, reading to the elderly tenants on the estate, and keeping the household accounts that her mother found tedious. But tonight, everything felt different. The Duke of Ravenswood had arrived. Isabella was certainly the one Lady Marguerite had her sights set on, but Clara couldn't help the flutter of nervousness in her chest. The Duke, with his commanding presence and mysterious air, was a man of great power and wealth, and tonight he would see the two Hawthorne daughters, one of beauty, one of quiet reserve. Clara moved to the side of the room, observing the preparations with a growing sense of unease. The grand garden party had been meticulously planned by Lady Marguerite to showcase Isabella as the perfect match for the Duke. Clara had no illusions about her place in this scenario. She would stand by, unnoticed, as Isabella charmed the Duke and every other gentleman in attendance. It was the role she had played for years, her sister, the shining star, and her, the quiet, unremarkable one in the background. As the Duke's arrival drew near, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. She had spent so much time accepting her position, accepting that her beauty and charm were not the things that would win her a nobleman's heart. But still, she wondered, was there more to her than her mother's constant oversight? Could there ever be a place for her in this world of beauty and ambition? The moment the Duke entered the garden, his tall, broad figure cut a striking presence. The sunlight seemed to dim around him, as though the world had drawn a collective breath at his arrival. The whispers among the guests only grew louder as he made his way through the crowd, his calm grey eyes scanning the assembly with quiet authority. And then, to Clara's shock, he stopped before her, his gaze steady and thoughtful as he took in her presence. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice deep and warm, causing her to look up in surprise. "I must say, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Clara blinked, uncertain whether he was addressing her or someone else. Surely, he couldn't be referring to her. She was merely the wallflower, the unnoticed sister. But when their eyes met, she felt a small spark of something she couldn't quite name. For the briefest of moments, she was no longer just Clara, the quiet one. She was someone he noticed, someone he sought out. As the Duke of Ravenswood turns to Isabella, Clara realizes that this evening will be yet another chapter in her life, where she will remain in the shadows of her sister's beauty. But something about his steady gaze, the way he paused in front of her, lingers in her thoughts. Could he have seen her, or was it all just an accidental encounter? The Duke is expected to fall for Isabella at this garden party, and Clara must serve as her sister's companion, blending into the background, where she's always been comfortable. But as the evening unfolds, Clara feels an uneasy sense that this time, something might be different. The garden at Hawthorne Manor was alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of silver, and the rustling of satin and silk. Lady Marguerite had spared no expense in hosting the event. Flowers in full bloom adorned every corner, their sweet fragrance mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass and springtime air. White marble statues stood sentinel among the hedges, and crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the oak trees, catching the sunlight in 1,000 different directions. A string quartet played softly, its delicate notes dancing in the breeze as the guests of London's elite mingled, glasses of champagne in hand. Clara Hawthorne stood at the edge of the garden, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She had been placed deliberately on the periphery, as usual an invisible companion to her sister, Isabella, who was the undisputed star of the evening. Isabella, in her emerald gown, glittering with pearls and diamonds, was the focus of every man's attention. Her golden curls cascaded in perfect ringlets around her shoulders, her radiant smile effortlessly drawing admirers like moths to a flame. Clara, on the other hand, stood quietly near the refreshments table, her soft lilac gown blending with the blossoms around her. Her hair, pinned simply in a knot at the back of her head, lacked the intricate styling of Isabella's. While her sister fluttered and flirted with the most eligible bachelors in the room, Clara's role was always the same: to blend into the background, to offer the occasional smile, to quietly tend to the guests without drawing attention to herself. It was a role she had accepted long ago, but on this day, with the Duke of Ravenswood in attendance, it felt heavier than ever. She glanced toward Isabella, who was laughing as the Duke's young nephew, Thomas Blackwood, offered her a glass of lemonade. The sight of Isabella laughing, her voice lilting and melodious, was enough to make Clara sigh inwardly. Her sister was flawless, effortlessly charming, and at the center of it all, while Clara was left to observe, her presence unnoticed. Clara adjusted her gown, the soft fabric gently rustling as she moved to refill a platter of finger sandwiches, hoping the task would occupy her thoughts. She wasn't bitter, at least. She tried not to be. She had long accepted her role in life. It was simply easier this way. Let Isabella be the jewel of society. Let her shine in the limelight. Clara was content with her quiet, unremarkable existence, tending to her family's needs, managing the household accounts, and volunteering in the village. But even as she settled into her role, there was a part of Clara that longed to be seen not as Isabella's sister or a mere background figure, but as someone with worth in her own right. But that will never happen, Clara thought, squaring her shoulders. Not here, not in this world. The arrival of the Duke of Ravenswood, Adrian Blackwood, caused a ripple of excitement through the garden party. It wasn't often that the Duke graced London with his presence, and his sudden appearance had the guests murmuring in eager anticipation. Clara had heard the whispers. Adrian Blackwood, the elusive Duke, recently returned from several years abroad. He was said to be a man of quiet authority, a philanthropist whose work had taken him far from the glittering society he now returned to. Isabella, of course, was the first to take note of his arrival, her eyes lighting up as she straightened and gracefully walked toward him, her gown swirling around her like a living thing. Clara, as was expected, stood quietly aside, her presence barely acknowledged. The Duke's striking figure moved through the crowd with an air of calm command. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had an elegance about him, his dark brown hair neatly styled, his sharp grey eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet intelligence. His appearance alone was enough to draw a crowd, and as he made his way toward Isabella, Clara couldn't help but notice the subtle way his gaze lingered on her sister. Admiration, no doubt. Isabella was flawless, after all. Clara had no illusions about that, but as the evening wore on, Clara couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. There was something in the way the Duke interacted with others, something that made Clara wonder if, for once, the right person might see beyond Isabella's beauty. As the evening settled into its rhythm, with soft music filling the air and the gentle murmur of conversations all around, a sudden commotion drew Clara's attention. The sound of a thud, followed by a child's cry, shattered the calm. She turned just in time to see Thomas Blackwood, the Duke's young nephew, tumbling from one of the tall oak trees near the fountain. He had clearly lost his footing while attempting to climb, and now lay sprawled on the grass, clutching his leg. Isabella, standing nearby, gasped and recoiled in horror. The other guests froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was a chaotic few seconds, the shock and confusion evident on every face, but Clara didn't hesitate. Her heart quickened, but she moved swiftly, her instincts taking over. She rushed to Thomas's side, kneeling beside him, her hands steady as she gently assessed his injury. "Don't worry, Thomas," she said softly, her voice calm. "You've hurt your leg, but we'll take care of it." As she inspected the boy's ankle, her mind quickly sorted through the rudimentary knowledge she had learned from the village physicians. An injury like this could be sprained, perhaps even fractured, but with the right care, it could heal. She carefully placed her hands on his leg, feeling the tender area. "It's swollen, but I think it's just a sprain," Clara said, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she assessed the injury. Behind her, Clara heard the soft, impressed voice of the Duke. "You have the hands of a healer, Miss Clara," Adrian Blackwood remarked. Clara glanced up, meeting his steady grey eyes for the first time, and felt a strange flutter in her chest. His gaze was not like the others. It wasn't one of admiration for her sister's beauty. It wasn't a polite gaze that ignored her presence. It was a gaze of genuine interest, of someone who saw her, truly saw her, for what she was. She blushed, uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she replied softly, her hand still working to gently support Thomas's leg. Adrian's gaze softened as he watched her work. "You have a remarkable calmness about you," he observed, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking to her alone. "Most would have panicked, but you took charge. That is rare." Clara felt her cheeks burn hotter, but she said nothing, focusing on Thomas's injury. Adrian moved closer, his eyes never leaving her. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but there was no judgment, only respect. Once Thomas's injury had been attended to, and he was safely escorted away to rest, Clara straightened up. Her hands trembled slightly, but she fought to steady herself. She had done what was needed, and that was enough. But the Duke, Adrian Blackwood, was still there, standing close by. He smiled at her genuinely, warmly, and it was the first time Clara had ever felt that warmth directed toward her. "You're quite extraordinary, Miss Hawthorne," he said quietly, his voice low and intimate. "You have a way of calming those around you. I can see why your family holds you in such regard." Clara blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected those words to come from him, not from someone of his stature, someone so refined and powerful. She had always been the overlooked sister, the quiet one. But here was the Duke, a man who had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time. As the evening continued, the conversation and laughter around Clara faded into the background. She found herself moving through the crowd with a quiet confidence she had never felt before, the Duke's words echoing in her mind. Extraordinary. It was a word she had never thought anyone would use to describe her. She glanced across the garden, where Isabella was still the center of attention, laughing and twirling as she always did. But now, Clara didn't feel the sting of comparison as she had in the past. She had discovered something new about herself, something that didn't depend on beauty or social grace. Adrian's interest in her had not been sparked by her beauty or her place in society. It was something deeper, a connection formed by shared compassion and a genuine desire to help others. Clara was not the glamorous sister, but in that moment, she realized she didn't need to be. As the party drew to a close and the final strains of music faded into the night, Clara felt a sense of quiet satisfaction settle over her. Tonight, something had shifted, something that would change her life forever. And Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenswood, had noticed. The early morning sun cast soft light over the cobblestone streets of London as Clara Hawthorne made her way to St. Mary's Hospital. She walked with purpose, her steps quick and sure despite the quiet hum of the city around her. The world here, away from the grand parties of society and the pressure of expectations, felt more in tune with who she truly was. Here, in the sterile halls of the hospital, Clara could be herself an aide, a listener, a compassionate hand. She had been volunteering at St. Mary's for several months now, following her mother's reluctant acceptance of her desire to help the less fortunate. At first, Lady Marguerite had expressed little more than disdain for Clara's choice of work, dismissing it as beneath their station. But Clara had persisted. Volunteering at the hospital gave her a sense of purpose that society's frivolous balls and shallow expectations could never provide. It was here, with the sick and the poor, that Clara felt truly seen, not for her looks, not for her title, but for her heart. Today was no different. Clara arrived early, the hospital's courtyard quiet as the first of the patients began trickling in. She helped with basic tasks, delivering meals, aiding the nurses in tending to wounds, and sitting with those in pain, offering words of comfort and gentle touches. It was simple work, the kind that required little skill but an abundance of empathy. Clara was good at it, perhaps even better than she realized. As Clara made her rounds, she found herself absorbed in the quiet rhythms of the hospital. There was something calming about the repetition of her tasks, the small acts of kindness that built a bridge between the suffering of others and her own heart. She'd learned early on to not let herself become too emotionally invested, to not allow the weight of the world's misfortunes to break her. Instead, she did what she could, one small act of service at a time. Her thoughts, as they often did, drifted to the events of the garden party. Adrian Blackwood, the Duke. It felt like a strange dream now, that moment in the garden when their eyes had met, when he had seen something in her that no one else had ever noticed. She had tried to dismiss it, telling herself that it was nothing, just an idle conversation sparked by a child's accident. But something had shifted in her that day, something that couldn't be easily undone. And so, she moved through her workday, pushing thoughts of him to the back of her mind. She had no right to dwell on such things, not when there were patients to care for, Not when her own place in society had already been set. Her future, she knew, would never be one of high titles and grand estates. It would be a life of quiet duty, far from the Duke's world. She was simply not meant for such luxuries. It was during her lunch break that she saw him, Adrian Blackwood, standing near the nurse's station, speaking with one of the attending physicians. She stopped in her tracks, caught off guard. He was not in his usual formal attire, but instead wore a simple coat and trousers, more fitting for an ordinary man than the Duke of Ravenswood. He looked out of place among the white walls of the hospital, but his presence seemed to command respect nonetheless. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched him speak to the physician. His voice, low and authoritative, carried across the room, and though she couldn't make out the words, she felt the weight of them. He was here on his own terms, not for society, not for appearances, but because he genuinely cared. He caught sight of her then. His grey eyes flickered over her, his expression softening just slightly. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly turned away, pretending to adjust a stack of papers on the desk. She knew better than to indulge in fantasies, especially about a man of his standing. Adrian Blackwood would never notice someone like her. But as the day wore on, it became clear that Adrian had noticed her. He made several more appearances over the course of the week, each time under the guise of checking in on the hospital's operations. But each time he would linger longer than necessary, always finding an excuse to speak with Clara. At first, it was about the patients. Then, it was about her work in the wards, her approach to helping the sick. Slowly, their conversations shifted from the mundane to the more personal, and Clara found herself becoming more comfortable with him. One afternoon, as they stood near the hospital's small garden, Adrian turned to her, his voice soft. "Miss Hawthorne," he began, as he had done so many times before, though the weight of his words carried more meaning this time. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Clara blinked in surprise. "Of course, Your Grace, what is it?" He hesitated, and for a moment, Clara thought he might not continue. But then he spoke again, his voice steady. "I've seen your work here, Clara. It's rare what you do. Most of society cares for the sick only when it is convenient for them, when it suits their reputations." He paused, looking directly at her. "You, however, care for them because you have a deep, genuine compassion. It's extraordinary." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such respect, with such admiration for her character. She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. "I do only what I can, Your Grace," she said softly. Adrian smiled, his eyes warm. "Please, call me Adrian," he said. "We've worked together enough for you to drop the formalities." Clara nodded, a slight blush creeping up her neck. She hadn't expected their conversation to take such an intimate turn, but there was something about Adrian that made her feel seen, not for her beauty or her family's status, but for who she truly was. The next day, Clara's world shifted again. She was summoned to Lady Marguerite's study, where her mother's sharp gaze met her as soon as she entered. "Clara," Lady Marguerite said, her voice tinged with irritation, "I've had enough of this nonsense." Clara blinked in confusion. "What nonsense, Mother?" "You know exactly what I mean," Lady Marguerite snapped. "Your charity work, your constant involvement at that hospital, it's embarrassing. It's not the work of a lady of your station." Clara stood frozen, the words cutting deeper than she expected. I thought it was something I could do to help," she said softly, her voice shaking with the effort to remain calm. "People need it. They need care, especially those who cannot afford it." Lady Marguerite's expression hardened. "No, you are a Hawthorne, and you will not lower yourself to such levels. You will stop this at once. Is that understood?" Clara's chest tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, Mother." But as she turned to leave, a small envelope caught her eye, lying on the desk. It was addressed to her in familiar handwriting. She took it quickly, not daring to open it in front of her mother. Once in her room, Clara tore the envelope open, finding a short note inside. "Your compassion is not common, it is extraordinary. Please do not let anyone diminish your light." The note was from Adrian. A sense of warmth spread through her as she held the letter in her hands. She wasn't alone in her feelings. Adrian saw her. And, for the first time, Clara realized that her path might not have to be confined by the limitations of her mother's expectations. But as the evening drew near, the weight of her situation settled back into her bones. She was torn between the woman she was becoming, the woman Adrian saw, and the woman her mother wanted her to be. The pressure to fit into society's mold, to abandon what brought her peace and fulfillment, was growing unbearable. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "You will not lower yourself to such levels." Clara wasn't sure how much longer she could live in the world her mother had created for her. Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it away, pressing it against her chest. She had always felt invisible, unnoticed by society's standards, but in Adrian Blackwood's eyes, she was something more. She was extraordinary, and that realization, though it was terrifying, was also the first step toward understanding that she didn't have to follow the path laid out for her by others. Her journey, and the bond she had formed with Adrian, had only just begun. The grand ballroom of Lady Pemberton's estate shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, their prisms catching the soft glow of hundreds of candles, casting a warm, golden light over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. The murmurs of London's finest society filled the air, accompanied by the soft strains of a string quartet playing a waltz in the corner. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the rustle of silk gowns blended together, creating the unmistakable buzz of a gathering where expectations and reputations hung like a delicate thread. Clara Hawthorne stood at the edge of the room, her position unchanged. She was not here to dance nor to be admired. She was simply an accessory to her sister, Isabella, who, in her emerald silk gown, golden curls cascading around her shoulders, had captured the attention of every man in the room. Isabella was radiant, a vision of beauty that seemed to demand adoration. She glided through the crowd with an air of effortless grace, the light catching her pearls as she laughed at some remark from a lord. Her every move seemed choreographed to perfection, and Clara, in her understated pale blue dress, stood quietly at the periphery, a shadow in the presence of her sister's brilliance. As usual, Clara's role was to be the quiet observer, content to watch her sister sparkle while she remained in the background, unnoticed by all but the few who had grown used to her modest presence. It was not a life she resented, at least not often. She had long accepted it. But tonight, there was a bitter taste in her mouth that she couldn't quite shake. The evening had started as it always did. Her mother, Lady Marguerite, had been hovering over Isabella, ensuring that she was the picture of perfection, as she always was. Clara, on the other hand, had been quietly standing aside, a glass of lemonade in hand, until the doors had opened and the Duke of Ravenswood entered. Adrian Blackwood, with his commanding presence, had been the talk of the town ever since his return from Scotland. He was known not only for his wealth and noble lineage, but for his elusive nature. Society had whispered about his aloofness, about the rumors of a broken heart after the death of his wife, and how he had withdrawn from the world of courtship altogether. But here he was now, standing among the guests with that same calm authority, his gaze sweeping over the room as though he were quietly observing every intricate detail. And, as expected, his eyes had briefly lingered on Clara before turning back to the crowd. Clara had hardly dared to hope that he had noticed her at all, that their brief exchange at the garden party would mean anything. But there had been that moment, that soft smile he had offered her when he had seen her tending to the injured Thomas Blackwood. Perhaps it was a fleeting gesture, a polite acknowledgement of her actions, but it had meant something to her. And now, as she watched him move across the ballroom, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of disappointment. He had returned to the world of the aristocracy, and she had returned to her place on the edge of it all. The evening had seemed to go on without incident, and Clara had resigned herself to standing silently by Isabella's side, playing the role of the invisible sister. But then, in the midst of the evening's festivities, Isabella took the floor with a dazzling smile, her voice ringing out above the noise of the crowd. "I have an announcement," Isabella said, her voice lilting, a mischievous glint in her eyes. The room quieted, all eyes turning to her. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She knew what was coming. She had known for weeks. Isabella was about to announce her engagement to the Duke of Ravenswood. "Adrian," Isabella continued, her gaze drifting to the Duke, who was now standing at the far side of the ballroom, his back straight as always, his demeanor composed. "Adrian has kindly agreed to make me his Duchess. We are to be married, and I could not be more thrilled to share this joyous news with all of you." The room erupted in applause, the guests exchanging delighted whispers. Clara's heart sank. She wanted to believe that it was all a mistake, that perhaps Isabella had misunderstood or exaggerated the Duke's intentions. But the triumphant look on Isabella's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Clara stood frozen, her hand tightening around the glass in her hand. The words didn't seem to reach her at first. We are to be married. It couldn't be real. It shouldn't be real. The Duke had never proposed to Isabella. She had made this up. But in that moment, Clara knew it didn't matter. The Duke would never be the one to correct the false announcement. He was in Scotland, far away from this charade. Clara's gaze shifted toward the corner of the ballroom, where Adrian stood alone, his expression unreadable. She had watched him carefully, seen the way he had looked at her, not Isabella, not the woman everyone assumed would capture his heart, but Clara. He had seen something in her that no one else had, and for a fleeting moment, she had dared to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, there could be something more between them. But now, as Isabella claimed the Duke's affections in front of the entire room, Clara felt a sharp pang in her chest. She wasn't angry at Isabella, no, that wasn't it. She was angry at herself, at her own foolishness for thinking that someone like Adrian Blackwood could ever look past the glittering facade of her beautiful sister to see the woman behind the books and the quiet service. Isabella had won again, and Clara had, once again, been left in the shadows. Clara fought to control her emotions, to keep her composure, but it was impossible. The weight of the evening settled heavily upon her shoulders. She had lived her entire life in Isabella's shadow, a role she had accepted with a certain quiet dignity. But in this moment, with Isabella basking in the attention of every guest and the Duke's absence hanging like a heavy cloud, Clara felt invisible more so than ever before. She could hear the laughter around her, the polite compliments about Isabella's beauty, the murmurs of excitement at the engagement, and yet none of it felt real. Clara had become so accustomed to being in the background that it almost felt as though this moment, this announcement, was happening to someone else. Is this my life? She wondered. Is this my place, forever standing quietly on the edges while my sister is praised and adored? For years, Clara had done her best to find contentment in the things that mattered most to her, reading to the elderly tenants, volunteering at the village clinic, managing the accounts at Hawthorne Manor. But these were not the things that made a woman desirable in society. These were not the things that earned her a marriage proposal from a duke. And yet, as the evening wore on and the guests continued to celebrate Isabella's announcement, Clara found herself feeling something she had not expected: relief. She was not the woman society wanted her to be. She was not the woman who could captivate a duke with a smile or wear a gown that made heads turn. And perhaps, in some strange way, that was okay. Perhaps, she thought, as she stood in the corner of the ballroom, watching her sister accept the admiration of the room, it was time to stop trying to fit into a world that would never accept her. By the time the night began to wind down, Clara had retreated to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the noise and the laughter. She needed space to breathe, to think, and to let the sting of Isabella's triumph fade into the background. Her eyes lingered on the empty chair beside the Duke's, his seat, the seat he had not taken because of a false engagement that had not even been his doing. Clara closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, the pain in her chest settling into something like acceptance. Perhaps this is my fate, she thought. Perhaps this is the role I'm meant to play: quiet, unseen, unnoticed. But deep down, Clara knew that there had to be more to her life than this. She could not continue to live for others' expectations. There had to be something more for her than being the invisible sister to Isabella's beauty. As the last notes of music floated across the ballroom, Clara made a decision. She would not remain in the shadows forever. She would not be the woman who was cast aside, resigned to a life of quiet service. She might never be the one to marry a duke or become the center of attention, but she would find a way to be seen not just by the duke, not just by society, but by herself. As Clara left the ballroom that night, her heart still heavy with the weight of her sister's false engagement, she knew one thing for certain: she was done waiting for a life that wasn't hers. It was time to take control, to step out from the shadow, and to carve her own path, whatever it may be. The streets of London were alive with activity, the clamour of carriage wheels on cobblestone streets mixing with the hum of voices as the social season reached its height. At Hawthorne Manor, however, a storm was brewing that no one could have predicted. The Hawthorne family's name, once a symbol of grace and sophistication, was now being whispered about in every drawing room, every salon, every corner of high society. Clara Hawthorne had always been an outsider, standing in the shadow of her younger sister Isabella's dazzling beauty, but even she could not have imagined the weight of the scandal that was about to descend upon her. The rumours had begun innocently enough. The whispers started at Lady Pemberton's soirée, where Isabella had announced her engagement to the Duke of Ravenswood. At first, they had been harmless, a few murmurs of surprise, a couple of raised eyebrows. But then, as gossip always did, the story began to grow. The more it was passed from one person to the next, the more it twisted, and soon Clara was at the centre of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything her family had built. The rumours were nothing short of vicious. It started with Countess Vivienne Sterling, a woman of considerable influence in London society who had once sought Adrian's affections but had been swiftly rebuffed. The Countess, whose beauty had once captivated the Duke, had never been able to let go of her unrequited love. When she learned of Adrian's growing interest in Clara, she couldn't bear it. Her jealousy, fueled by years of resentment, manifested in the most damaging way possible. It began with a quiet conversation over tea at one of London's most exclusive clubs. Countess Vivienne, in her impeccable black lace gown, had expertly steered the conversation toward the Duke's new companion, Clara Hawthorne. With a sly smile and a conspiratorial tone, she had begun weaving her tale of scandal. "I hear that the Duke of Ravenswood and Miss Hawthorne are quite close," Vivienne said softly, making sure the words reached the ears of those seated nearby. "Close enough that some have begun to wonder if she isn't more than just his intellectual companion, as they call it." A guest, a well-known gossip columnist, had raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" he asked, his pen already poised to record the next tidbit of society gossip. Vivienne leaned in, lowering her voice. "It's no secret that Miss Hawthorne has been spending an unusual amount of time with the Duke, and the way she carries herself so confident, so assured, it's as though she's been well trained in the arts of high society. But where did she come from, I wonder? The Hawthornes, while respectable, are not the sort of family one expects to see in such circles." Her voice dropped further, the words now tinged with scandal. "I suspect Miss Clara is not as innocent as she appears. Some are even suggesting she is Lord Hawthorne's illegitimate daughter, the result of an affair with one of their servants. A commoner's blood running through her veins, no wonder she's been so quick to gain the Duke's favour." The words fell like a heavy stone, creating ripples through the high society circles. Countess Vivienne's carefully constructed insinuations were like kindling, and they quickly caught fire. By the time the evening ended, Clara's name was being spoken in hushed tones all across London, her reputation already tarnished by the malicious whispers of one woman's jealousy. At Hawthorne Manor, the storm broke with devastating force. Lady Marguerite Hawthorne, who had always prided herself on her family's impeccable social standing, was horrified when she heard the rumours circulating about her eldest daughter. "Do you know what they're saying about Clara?" Lady Marguerite asked, her voice trembling with disbelief as she spoke to her husband, Lord Hawthorne, later that evening. "The audacity! They're saying she's the Duke's mistress, that she's been using her position in society to ensnare him. They even have the gall to suggest she's my illegitimate child." Lord Hawthorne looked just as stunned, his face pale as he absorbed the scandalous words. "This is preposterous," he said, shaking his head. "Clara has always been above reproach. These rumours are nothing but the venom of a scorned woman." But Lady Marguerite was not so easily placated. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with the strain of trying to keep control of her emotions. "This is going to ruin us. Our name, our standing in society, it's all at risk. Clara has brought this upon us with her foolishness." The tension between them grew, and Clara, standing just outside the study, overheard the conversation. Her heart sank as her mother's words pierced her, a mixture of anger and sadness swirling within her. She had never asked for this, never asked for the attention or the scandal. All she had ever wanted was to be seen for who she truly was, a woman with kindness and compassion, someone who cared for the sick and the poor. But now, that image was being shattered by lies and malicious rumours. It was then that Clara received a letter, one that would offer her a brief moment of solace amidst the storm. The elegant handwriting on the front was unmistakable Adrian Blackwood. She had not expected to hear from him again, not after the events of the garden party. The note, tucked neatly into the envelope, was brief, but filled with quiet strength. I care not for society's opinion. Your heart and kindness are the only things that matter to me. Clara closed her eyes, letting the words settle over her like a balm. Adrian's defense was a rare and precious thing, especially in a world where appearances and reputation meant everything. To him, Clara's worth was not defined by the whispers of society, not by the false rumors spread by a bitter countess. His words were a quiet affirmation of everything she had hoped was true, that there was more to her than society had ever seen. But even as the warmth of his words soothed her, Clara knew that the battle was far from over. Her mother's disappointment, her family's growing resentment, it all weighed heavily on her. She was caught between two worlds, the world of her mother's ambitions and the world of her own heart. The world where kindness and compassion mattered, where she could be herself without the constraints of title and status. But Clara was beginning to realize that she could no longer exist in the shadows. The battle for her identity, who she was and what she stood for, was one she could no longer avoid. The Duke's words were comforting, but they were not enough to shield her from the storm of gossip that had already begun to ruin her reputation. As the days passed, Clara's internal conflict deepened. She could not escape the feeling that she was being torn in two directions, one toward the expectations of her family, and the other toward the life she truly wanted to live, a life that had no place for titles or grandeur, only genuine connection and compassion. Clara could no longer live a life defined by what others expected of her. She could not continue to hide in the shadows, playing the role of the invisible sister. She had to find her own path, even if it meant defying her family and society. And though she had no idea what that path might look like, she knew one thing for certain. She could not let the lies and the false rumors dictate her future. The following day, Clara sat in the quiet of her room, the letter from Adrian still clutched in her hand. She had never been the one to seek attention or defy her family, but in this moment, she realized that the time had come to stop hiding. She had to confront the rumors head-on, for her own peace of mind and for the chance to live a life that was truly hers. The decision was not an easy one, but Clara knew that if she continued to stand by, silent and unseen, the world would continue to define her as they pleased. She would remain invisible, forever trapped in the shadow of her beautiful sister. As she folded the letter and placed it carefully in her drawer, Clara made a vow to herself. She would no longer let society's expectations dictate her fate. She would stand tall, regardless of the gossip, regardless of the scandal. Adrian had seen her for who she truly was. Now it was time for Clara to see herself the same way. And when the time came, she would no longer be afraid to step out from the shadows and claim the life she had always dreamed of. The battle was far from over, but Clara knew that with each passing day, she was becoming stronger. The weight of the rumors, the judgment of society, and the disapproval of her mother no longer held the power they once had. Clara had found something far more valuable, her own sense of worth, a recognition of who she truly was, and the courage to stand firm in it. As the world continued to spin around her, Clara stood resolute, ready to face whatever came next with the quiet strength and compassion that had always been her true legacy. The Pemberton Ball was one of the most anticipated events of the London social season, an evening where the city's elite gathered to celebrate wealth, beauty, and the promises of advantageous marriages. The chandeliers above cast a warm, golden light over the ballroom, and the air buzzed with polite conversation, the rustle of silk, and the clink of crystal. Ladies glided across the floor, their gowns shimmering in the candlelight, while the men, handsome in their tailored evening coats, watched from the sidelines, eyes lingering on their chosen partners. It was an evening designed to dazzle, to impress, and to secure futures. Clara Hawthorne, however, felt none of the glittering excitement that swirled around her. She stood just outside the ballroom, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Tonight was supposed to be Isabella's night, the night she would announce her engagement to the Duke of Ravenswood, the man who had captured the attention of every eligible lady in London. The ball had been arranged with such careful precision by Lady Marguerite, and Clara, as usual, was to play the role of supportive sister, unseen, unnoticed, and, most importantly, silent. Yet, as the guests filled the room and Isabella, radiant in her sapphire gown, her golden curls cascading down her back, took her place at the center of the celebration, Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. The weight of the evening was not lost on her. It was heavy with expectations, both from her family and from society. It was a night that would either seal her sister's future or cast Clara into the shadows once again. But it wasn't just the usual unease she felt. Tonight, something was different. Tonight, the air crackled with tension, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change, whether she was ready or not. As the night wore on, Clara watched from the sidelines as Isabella basked in the admiration of every man in the room. The guests crowded around her, fawning over her beauty and grace, praising her imminent engagement to the Duke. Isabella seemed to glow under the attention, her smile dazzling, her laughter light and carefree. To anyone who was watching, it was clear Isabella was the queen of the evening. Clara, on the other hand, had retreated to the corner of the ballroom, feeling the familiar sting of invisibility. Her pale blue dress, simple in design, stood in stark contrast to the luxurious gowns that surrounded her. She wasn't meant to be seen, and she had long since accepted that. So, she stood quietly by, her gaze drifting across the crowd, her mind racing. She had not spoken to Adrian since the garden party, a fleeting encounter that had left her heart in a state of confusion. The moment he had looked at her, really looked at her, had been one of the most unexpected things to ever happen in her life. But now, as she watched him move through the room, his calm, steady presence filling the space around him, Clara wondered if she had only imagined the connection they shared. Surely, someone like him, powerful, noble, admired, could never be truly interested in someone like her. But still, when their eyes met across the room, Clara's heart skipped a beat. Adrian, the Duke of Ravenswood, was the epitome of everything she had been taught to believe she could never attain. Wealth, power, status. And yet, his gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer than it did on the others, and that small flicker of recognition only added to the mounting tension in Clara's chest. Isabella was the center of attention, as expected, but Clara felt an inexplicable sense of dread settle over her. Something was not right. The whispers that had been circulating about her, about the fabricated rumors of her supposed involvement with Adrian, seemed to grow louder in her ears. The more she thought about them, the more she realized how much they had begun to affect her. The malicious gossip from Countess Vivian Sterling, the false accusations that had been spread, had taken their toll on Clara. She was used to being overlooked, but the rumors were different. They were destructive. They threatened everything she had worked so hard to build, her integrity, her self-worth, and the small peace she had found in her quiet, unnoticed life. As Clara stood near the edge of the ballroom, the murmurs of the crowd began to grow louder. Isabella, clearly enjoying the attention, stepped forward, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She turned to the Duke, who had been watching her intently, and with a practiced smile, she addressed the guests. "It is with great joy," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the room, "that I announce my engagement to His Grace, Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by applause and congratulatory cheers. The guests exchanged knowing glances, some nodding in approval, others eager to join in the celebration of what they believed was an inevitable match. Clara felt as though the room had suddenly closed in around her. The announcement wasn't a surprise, of course. Isabella was, after all, the woman everyone expected Adrian to marry. She was beautiful, poised, and destined for greatness. But what Clara had not anticipated was the cold, sinking feeling in her stomach, the realization that this was all a lie. Before she could fully process the rush of emotions that threatened to overtake her, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Isabella Hawthorne," Adrian's voice rang out, clear and steady. "I must address a matter of great importance." The room fell silent. The air seemed to still as all eyes turned to him. Adrian stood at the far side of the ballroom, his posture tall and unyielding. His grey eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on Isabella before turning to face the crowd. "Miss Isabella Hawthorne has announced an engagement that does not exist," Adrian said, his voice unwavering. "I have never proposed to her." "Adrian," the words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was deafening. The guests exchanged bewildered looks, unsure of how to react. Isabella's face drained of color, and Clara's heart raced in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The Duke had just publicly denied the engagement, exposed the lie for all to see. As the shock of Adrian's statement reverberated through the room, the Duke turned toward Clara, his gaze locking onto hers. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest, as Adrian slowly made his way across the room toward her. The crowd seemed to part in reverence as he approached, his eyes never leaving hers. "The only woman I have ever considered as my Duchess," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction, "is Miss Clara Hawthorne." The words were like a thunderclap in the room. Clara's eyes widened, her pulse quickening as the implications of his statement sank in. She had expected the Duke to deny the false engagement, but she had never imagined he would turn the attention so completely toward her. The guests, who had once admired Isabella for her beauty and grace, now turned their gaze to Clara, who stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. Isabella's face twisted with humiliation. The bright smile she had worn just moments ago had vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and disbelief. Clara, too, stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel elation or dread. Adrian had chosen her not because of her beauty, but because of something else entirely, something she had never considered before, the possibility that he saw her, truly saw her, for who she was, beyond the whispers and the rumors. The room was buzzing with questions, the sound of confused murmurs filling the space as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Countess Vivienne Sterling, who had been hovering near Isabella, stepped forward, her face contorted in an attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is absurd," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. "The Duke is clearly confused. Miss Clara is—" Adrian interrupted her, his voice cold and authoritative. "Countess, I am not confused. You, on the other hand, have made your intentions quite clear. You've spread lies, rumors that have no basis in truth. Miss Clara Hawthorne is not only my choice for a wife, but she is also the woman I respect most in this room. You, Countess, will not be allowed to continue your deceit any longer." The Countess's face went pale as her fabricated stories were exposed. The room, once buzzing with whispers of admiration for Isabella, now hummed with disbelief and shock. Adrian's words had cut through the web of lies spun by Countess Vivienne, exposing the malicious scheme that had been designed to ruin Clara's reputation. Isabella, her pride shattered, stood motionless, unable to respond. Her world, built on beauty and societal expectations, was crumbling around her. As the evening unfolded, the guests slowly began to dissipate, their murmurs turning to silence as they filed out of the ballroom. Clara stood at the center of the room, her heart still pounding from the events that had just transpired. Adrian's public declaration had changed everything, but it had also left her with a new sense of clarity. She was no longer the invisible sister, the quiet shadow of Isabella. Adrian had seen her not for her beauty, but for her heart, her character, and her ability to care for those around her. It was a gift that society had failed to recognize, but Adrian had noticed. And in that moment, Clara knew that her life would never be the same again. The soft crackle of the fire in the hearth seemed to echo through the grand drawing room of Hawthorne Manor, adding an unexpected warmth to the otherwise tense atmosphere. The walls, adorned with portraits of long-gone ancestors and gilded mirrors that reflected the gaslight, now seemed to close in on Clara as she stood at the far side of the room. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, betraying the nervous energy that buzzed beneath her calm exterior. Lord Hawthorne, her father, stood at the center of the room, his face pale and drawn. He held a letter in his hands, an envelope of thick, cream-colored paper that seemed to carry a weight far beyond its mere appearance. Clara could feel the significance of the moment pressing down on her, the very air in the room charged with anticipation. The letter her father held was the final piece of the puzzle, the truth that would either expose the malicious lies that had haunted her or destroy any hope she had left of clearing her name. It had been days since Adrian's bold public denial of Isabella's fabricated engagement announcement, days since the scandal surrounding her name had reached a fever pitch. Clara had done her best to retreat from the public eye, avoiding society's prying eyes and the whispers that followed her wherever she went. But no matter how much she tried to shield herself, the rumors first spun by Countess Vivienne Sterling and then perpetuated by the gossips of London continued to spread like wildfire, threatening to consume everything she had. The accusations had been brutal. Clara, the supposed mistress of the Duke, the illegitimate daughter of Lord Hawthorne and a servant. The lies had tainted her reputation, her name now synonymous with scandal. The weight of the falsehoods had almost been too much to bear, and Clara had found herself retreating further into the solitude of Hawthorne Manor, trying to find solace in the quiet corners of the house. But now, the moment of truth had come. Her father's voice broke through the silence, his tone steady but laced with an edge of resolve. "Clara," he began, addressing her with the kind of formality that came from years of societal expectations. But beneath it, Clara could sense his quiet fury. "What we are about to reveal will put an end to this madness once and for all." Clara nodded, though her heart raced in her chest. She had always trusted her father, his dignity, his honor, but the weight of this moment felt like a turning point. Everything would change after today, one way or another. With a final glance at her, Lord Hawthorne turned to the gathered guests, a handful of close family and trusted confidants. The letter from his late wife, Lady Margaret, was now open in his hands. Her handwriting, so familiar and full of love, seemed to mock the injustice that had been done to their family. Clara's eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. Her mother had passed away years ago, but she had left behind a legacy of integrity. It was her final words, now to be read aloud, that would confirm Clara's legitimacy and silence the rumors once and for all. "Lady Margaret wrote this letter before her passing," Lord Hawthorne continued, his voice unwavering. "In it, she leaves a clear record of Clara's birth and her rightful place in this family. It is time for the world to know the truth." He unfolded the letter, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he began to read aloud. Clara listened intently, the words taking on a weight she had never expected. "To my beloved husband, William, and to my dear daughters, Isabella and Clara, I write this letter with the knowledge that time is a fickle thing, and that one day, when I am no longer with you, you may face questions that only this letter can answer. Clara, our eldest daughter, is every bit as legitimate as her sister, Isabella. I carry no regret in this truth, nor in the love I have for both of you. She is of our blood, my dear William, and her place as your daughter will forever stand, no matter the whispers that may come." Clara's breath caught in her throat as her father continued, the words from her mother's letter echoing in the room like a clarion call for justice. "There are those who may question her legitimacy. There are those who may suggest she was born of lesser means, the product of some affair or scandal. Let these rumors be known for what they are, nothing more than baseless lies meant to tarnish the Hawthorne name. Clara is your daughter, and nothing will change that." As her father finished reading the letter, Clara felt the weight of its truth wash over her. She had known in her heart that she was not the product of scandal, but hearing her mother's words confirmed it in a way nothing else could. For the first time in days, Clara felt a small sense of relief. The truth, though long hidden, had finally come to light. The truth was out, but Clara's relief was short-lived. Just as her father placed the letter back on the desk, the door to the drawing room burst open with force, and Lady Marguerite rushed in, her face flushed with panic. "You cannot," she began, her voice thick with emotion, but her words faltered as she looked around at the guests. Her gaze landed on Clara, and for the first time, Clara saw something in her mother's eyes: regret, shame, and a deep, unspoken understanding of the weight of her own actions. Before anyone could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps outside the room interrupted. The door opened once again, and Countess Vivienne Sterling entered, her head held high, her gaze steely with a combination of disbelief and defiance. She had been watching the entire scene unfold from the hallway, and it was clear that she had no intention of letting Clara's name be cleared so easily. "I see we are reading letters now," Countess Vivienne said with a sneer, her eyes flashing with contempt. "How quaint. But I must say, Lord Hawthorne, that this sudden revelation does nothing to undo the damage that has already been done. The truth does not change the fact that Miss Clara has been seen in public, entwined with the Duke of Ravenswood, her name whispered about in the most disreputable circles. A mistress, a bastard, those are the names she will forever carry, no matter what you say now." Her words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. The Countess's malicious grin spread as she saw the discomfort on the faces of the assembled guests. Clara could feel the old familiar sting of society's judgment creeping back into her chest. But Adrian Blackwood was not about to let Vivienne have the last word. He entered the room at that moment, his presence as commanding as it had been at the ball. His eyes were cold with authority, and his jaw was set with an expression that left no room for doubt. "Countess Sterling," he said, his voice low and steady, "your lies are as transparent as your motivations." You've spent years trying to destroy the Hawthorne family, and now you've stooped to the lowest depths to try and ruin Miss Clara." The Countess opened her mouth to retort, but Adrian raised a hand to silence her. "Do not speak. You have already done enough damage. Your reputation is tarnished, and your lies are exposed." He turned to Lord Hawthorne, who stood with the letter in his hands, still processing the weight of the revelations. "Lord Hawthorne," Adrian continued, his voice firm, "the truth is on your side, and it is time for this malicious woman to leave London." Countess Vivienne's face blanched with anger as Adrian spoke. Her eyes darted between the guests, now murmuring among themselves in shock and disbelief. The Countess's carefully constructed social image was crumbling before her very eyes. Her years of scheming, of trying to secure the Duke's affections, had led her here, exposed, defeated, and humiliated. "This is not the end of this," Vivienne hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You think you've won, but the damage is done. The rumors will persist. You cannot silence them forever." But Adrian stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "The only thing that will persist is the truth. And the truth, Countess, is that you have lied, manipulated, and schemed your way through this. Now, you will face the consequences. It's over." As Vivienne turned to leave, her face flushed with rage, the guests in the room watched her exit with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. There was no more pretense, no more polite conversation. The Countess had been unmasked for the manipulative social climber she truly was. With Vivienne's departure, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Clara stood in the center, still processing the turn of events. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? The rumors, the lies, the scandal, it had all been laid bare for everyone to see. Clara felt exposed, vulnerable, but in some strange way, she also felt lighter. The weight of the accusations had been lifted, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, she could finally breathe. Adrian's presence beside her was a quiet reassurance. He had defended her when no one else had, and in doing so, he had shown her that there was more to her than what society had chosen to see. As Clara looked up at him, she saw not just the Duke of Ravenswood, but the man who had stood by her side, who had believed in her when the world had not. And in that moment, Clara knew that she had found something far more valuable than societal approval. She had found the truth, and the truth was enough. The storm was not over, but for the first time, Clara felt a sense of peace. The truth had won, and it was hers to hold. The house had never felt so quiet. Clara stood at the window, watching the soft grey sky stretch across the horizon, her mind heavy with the weight of the past few days. The scandal, the rumors, the public humiliation, everything had come to a head in such a short amount of time. Now, in the stillness of the morning, it felt as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. It had been 3 days since the revelation at the Pemberton ball, the day Adrian had publicly denounced Isabella's false engagement and declared his intentions toward Clara. Since then, the house had been abuzz with preparations, not for the usual social gatherings, but for something much more personal. Lady Marguerite, Clara's mother, had suffered a collapse in the wake of the public scandal, her fragile composure shattered by the strain of the events. Clara, who had always been the one to step back and remain unseen, now found herself in a position she had never anticipated, one of the primary caretakers for her mother, a woman who had once expected Clara to serve as nothing more than a quiet ornament on the fringes of their family's social life. As Clara stood in the window, she could hear the soft murmur of voices from the other side of the house. Her father, Lord Hawthorne, was speaking with the physician who had been tending to Lady Marguerite, his words low but filled with a sense of concern. He had always been a man of action, steady and composed, but there was a vulnerability to him now that Clara had never seen before. "Is she going to be all right?" Clara asked softly, not turning from the window. Her father's footsteps were faint as he approached her. "She will recover, but it will take time," he said quietly. The shock was simply too much for her. Clara nodded, though her mind was far away, lost in the echoes of the past. She had spent so many years trying to meet her mother's impossible standards, always coming up short in her eyes. For so long, Lady Marguerite had treated Clara as an afterthought, the plain daughter, the one who could never compete with the dazzling Isabella. But now, with the weight of the public scandal upon them, it seemed that Lady Marguerite was finally beginning to see the truth. It had been Adrian who had finally shattered the illusion that had held their family in place. His defense of Clara and his public acknowledgement of her worth had peeled away the layers of pretense and shown them all something real. But what had been most surprising of all was how this truth had forced Lady Marguerite to face her own role in the situation, the way she had treated Clara, always placing Isabella's beauty and charm above her daughter's kindness and intelligence. It was later that afternoon when Clara finally entered her mother's room. Lady Marguerite lay in bed, propped up by pillows, her face pale and drawn. There was something fragile about her now, something Clara had never seen before. Gone was the woman who had always commanded attention, who had filled every room with her presence and expectations. Instead, there was a woman who had been broken open by the very world she had once controlled. Clara hesitated at the door, unsure of how to approach. Her relationship with her mother had always been strained, filled with unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. Lady Marguerite had never been an easy woman to please, and Clara had spent most of her life feeling like she would never be enough, never beautiful enough, never social enough, never the perfect daughter Isabella had been groomed to be. But as Clara stepped closer to the bed, she saw something in her mother's eyes that she had never seen before. Vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Clara." Lady Marguerite's voice was faint, barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Clara felt the words like a sharp pang in her chest. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to hear those words from her mother, who had so often pushed her aside in favor of Isabella. She sat by her mother's bedside, unsure of what to say, her throat tight with emotion. Lady Marguerite turned her gaze toward her, her eyes full of regret. "I was so blinded by Isabella's beauty that I failed to see I had two remarkable daughters. I nearly destroyed the one with true worth." The words hit Clara with a force she hadn't anticipated. Her mother, the woman who had always seemed so distant and critical, was now speaking with a tenderness Clara had never known from her. "I never meant to hurt you," Lady Marguerite continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I always thought I was doing what was best for you, pushing you to be better, to be more like Isabella. But I see now. I see what I did to you, and I regret it deeply." Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she reached for her mother's hand, gently taking it in her own. The touch was tentative at first, unsure, but it felt like the beginning of something new, something that had been lost for so long. "It's all right, Mother," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me. I didn't know if you'd ever see me, truly see me." Lady Marguerite squeezed her hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I see you now, Clara. I see you for who you truly are: strong, kind, and compassionate. You've always had the strength to stand on your own, to care for others, while I was too busy trying to push you into a mold that never fit. I was wrong." Clara felt a surge of emotion in her chest, the years of hurt, of feeling invisible, flooding to the surface. She swallowed hard, fighting to keep her composure. "I know, Mother," she said softly, "and I've learned to live with it. But I'm not the woman you wanted me to be, and maybe that's for the best." Lady Marguerite smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "No, Clara, you are exactly who you were meant to be, and if I had seen that sooner, I would have spared you so much pain. But now I want to make things right. I want to be the mother you deserve." The words felt like a balm to Clara's soul, healing wounds that had been open for far too long. She had never imagined hearing them, had never expected her mother to acknowledge the pain she had caused. But here, in this quiet room, it was happening, and Clara, for the first time in years, felt as though she were finally being seen, truly seen. In the days that followed, Lady Marguerite's transformation continued. The strength she had once demanded of Clara, the impossible standards she had set for her daughters, were replaced by a new understanding, a recognition that beauty and grace were not the only qualities that mattered. Clara's quiet intelligence, her compassion, and her ability to care for others were qualities that had always made her remarkable. Lady Marguerite, though still recovering from the physical toll of her collapse, became a staunch defender of Clara. She stood by her side as the rumors about Clara's supposed affair with Adrian began to die down, her position in society solidifying once again. It was not just the Hawthorne family name that mattered, it was Clara's own worth, her character, and the quiet strength that had always been present. At one of the final gatherings held at Hawthorne Manor, to celebrate Lady Marguerite's recovery, She stood in front of their guests and addressed them with an air of quiet dignity. "My daughters," she began, her voice clear and strong, "have both proven themselves worthy of your admiration. Isabella's beauty and grace have captured many hearts, but Clara's strength, her compassion, and her dedication to others have always been her greatest gifts." Clara's heart swelled as her mother's words washed over her. Lady Marguerite had never spoken to her with such openness before, never acknowledged her worth in front of others. But now, Clara could see that her mother had finally recognized the true value of her daughter, not the one who fit into society's mold, but the one who had always quietly stood apart, offering her heart to those who needed it most. As the evening wore on and the guests congratulated Clara on the strength she had shown, Lady Marguerite stood by her side, no longer the woman who demanded perfection, but the woman who had finally learned to appreciate her daughter's true worth. Clara knew, as she stood there, that her relationship with her mother had been irrevocably changed, and though their journey was far from complete, she now felt a new sense of peace. The past, with all its disappointments, had finally been set aside. It was time to move forward together. The Pemberton Ball had always been a highlight of the London social season, a glittering affair where the city's most distinguished families gathered to celebrate wealth, beauty, and ambition. The ballroom was alive with soft music, elegant laughter, and the shimmer of diamonds and pearls, the chandeliers casting a warm glow over the guests. But tonight, for Clara Hawthorne, the scene was charged with something far more powerful than mere social expectation. The whispers had begun in the moments before the ball had started, rumors that swirled in the wake of the scandalous events of the previous weeks. Clara, once the overlooked sister, now found herself the center of attention, though not in the way she ever expected. Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenswood, had made his intentions clear. Yet, as she stepped into the room that night, Clara's heart raced with uncertainty. She had no idea how the evening would unfold, or what Adrian's next move would be. But one thing was certain: everything had changed. The air was thick with anticipation as Clara entered the ballroom, her modest yet graceful gown a quiet contrast to the extravagance around her. Her mother, Lady Marguerite, stood nearby, her eyes glinting with pride for the first time in a long while. Beside her, Isabella, radiant as always in her dazzling gown, smiled with a quiet satisfaction, her hand resting on the arm of Captain Nicholas Blackwood, Adrian's younger brother. Despite the overwhelming weight of the evening, Clara stood tall, no longer the plain sister, no longer the one in the shadows. She had found a quiet strength that had been waiting to emerge all along. Her heart, though unsure, was full with the knowledge that, for the first time, she was in control of her own destiny. The woman she had always been was finally being seen. As the evening progressed, the guests congratulated Clara on her newfound role in society, her engagement to Adrian Blackwood, and her transformation from the quiet daughter of the Hawthorne family to someone who had caught the eye of the most eligible duke in London. Yet the weight of society's gaze was not as suffocating as it once had been. With Adrian's love, Clara had found her voice, her purpose, and tonight, as the room buzzed with excitement, she knew she was about to face the ultimate test. The moment the music slowed and the crowd began to shift in anticipation, Clara's pulse quickened. She turned her gaze toward the Duke, who stood at the center of the ballroom. He had arrived with the usual air of composure, tall, poised, every inch the nobleman he was. But tonight, his eyes were different. They were fixed on Clara, and in that moment, she knew that tonight would be the culmination of everything that had led her here. The moment arrived without warning. The orchestra fell silent, the guests holding their collective breath as Adrian Blackwood moved forward, his presence commanding the room. He took his place in the center of the floor, and all eyes turned toward him. The murmurs grew louder as Adrian stepped to the edge of the ballroom, his gaze meeting Clara's across the sea of guests. For a brief moment, it felt as if time had slowed, the world narrowing to just the two of them. The guests waited, and Clara's heart thundered in her chest. She had expected this moment, the proposal that had been hinted at for weeks, the culmination of their public courtship, but she had not anticipated the weight of it, nor the way her entire world would feel like it was hanging in the balance. Then, as if the silence of the room was a cue, Adrian spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests," he began, his voice clear and steady, filling the room with its authority. "There is something I must address tonight, a matter of great importance to me." A hush fell over the room, the weight of his words sinking in. Clara could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but her gaze was fixed on Adrian, who stood before her with a quiet certainty. "Miss Isabella Hawthorne," he continued, his voice unwavering, "has announced an engagement that does not exist. I have never proposed to her. The engagement she spoke of, the one that has been celebrated by society, was never my doing. It is a fabrication, and I cannot allow it to stand any longer." The room erupted in gasps, a collective shock reverberating through the crowd. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but she stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing to make sense of what Adrian had just said. Had he really just... Before the murmurs could escalate, Adrian turned toward Clara, his gaze softening as their eyes met. The crowd fell still once more. "The only woman I have ever considered as my duchess," he said, his voice resonating through the silence, "is Miss Clara Hawthorne." The words, so simple yet profound, hung in the air, and for a moment, Clara felt as though the world had stopped. Every set of eyes in the ballroom was now fixed on her, and the weight of their collective gaze seemed to settle heavily upon her shoulders. But there was no panic, no fear, only an overwhelming sense of truth. Clara had expected many things from this evening, but never this. She had thought she would remain in the background, forever eclipsed by Isabella's brilliance, never seen for anything more than the quiet sister. But in that moment, Adrian had done what no one else had. He had seen her, truly seen her, for all that she was. He had chosen her, not because of her beauty, not because of some grand display of social grace, but because of who she was, her heart, her strength, and her kindness. A murmur swept through the crowd, the words "scandal" and "surprise" floating in hushed whispers. But Clara, for the first time in her life, did not feel the sting of judgment. Adrian had made his choice, and it was a choice she never could have imagined, but one she now knew, with absolute certainty, she would accept. Adrian walked toward her, the crowd parting to allow him space. His eyes, steady and warm, never left hers as he approached, and when he reached her, he took her hand gently in his. Clara's heart raced as she looked into his eyes. The world around them seemed to fade, the noise of the ballroom no longer reaching her. She could only hear Adrian's voice, soft and steady. "Clara, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Will you join me, not only as my duchess, but as my partner in all the work we both hold dear?" For the first time in her life, Clara felt truly seen. Not for her sister's beauty, not for her family's name, but for who she truly was. And in that moment, all of the doubts, all of the years of feeling overlooked, disappeared. "Yes, with all my heart," Clara replied, her voice steady and strong. "I will marry you." The room erupted into applause, but Clara's gaze never left Adrian's. The proposal, though public and grand, had been the most intimate moment of her life. She had never imagined that the Duke of Ravenswood, one of the most sought-after men in London, would choose her, not because of her beauty, but because of something far more profound, the depth of her character. The evening, which had begun with uncertainty, now felt like a new beginning, not just for Clara but for her entire future. She was no longer the invisible sister, the one who stood in the background. She had found her place in the world not as a duchess to be admired from afar, but as a partner to a man who saw her as his equal, his true love. The wedding at St. Mary's Cathedral was an event of immense importance, attended by both Clara's and Adrian's families, as well as the highest echelons of London's elite. The cathedral's towering spires rose toward the heavens, and the air was filled with the sound of a choir singing hymns of love and union. Clara, standing at the altar beside Adrian, felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. Her gown was simple yet elegant lace and satin woven together to create a timeless piece that matched her understated beauty. She walked down the aisle with her father by her side, her heart beating steadily in her chest. The eyes of the congregation were upon her, but it was Adrian's gaze that she focused on. His eyes were filled with warmth, and in them Clara saw not just a man who loved her, but a man who believed in her, who believed in the work they would do together. When Adrian spoke his vows, they were not just promises of love, they were promises of service, of a life spent working to better the world they lived in. "I promise to honor not just you, but the calling we share," Adrian said, his voice firm and steady, "to serve those society forgets, to build hospitals where there are none, and to use our privilege as a tool for compassion." Clara's heart swelled as she repeated her vows, pledging to be the woman Adrian had always believed her to be. "I promise to be a duchess who kneels beside the sick, who remembers the names of tenant children, who never forgets that true nobility is measured in kindness, not titles." Their kiss, soft and tender, sealed the promises they had made to one another. As they stepped back, Clara felt the weight of their union, their shared commitment to a life of service, love, and compassion. Clara's transformation into the beloved Duchess of Ravenswood was not just a shift in title, but a shift in the very essence of who she was. She had become a respected figure in her own right, leading the charge for new charitable hospitals, pioneering social reforms, and providing a voice to those who had none. As she stood beside Adrian, watching the world they had begun to build together, Clara realized how far she had come from the quiet sister in the shadows to a woman of influence, of purpose, and of love. She had found her place, not just as Adrian's wife, but as a leader who would use her position for good. Isabella, now happily married to Captain Nicholas Blackwood, found her own path to happiness, free from the societal pressures that had once confined her. The two sisters, once rivals, shared a quiet moment one afternoon, reflecting on the journey they had both traveled. "Clara," Isabella said, her voice soft, "I never realized how much you had to offer. You've changed everything." Clara smiled, her heart light. "We've both found our way, Isabella. True love transcends beauty, social expectations, and titles. It's about being seen for who you really are." And so, Clara and Isabella, two sisters who had once been at odds, found a common ground, one built not on beauty or status, but on the love and understanding they had both finally come to embrace. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey with Clara and Adrian. If you enjoyed their story of love, resilience, and breaking free from societal expectations, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. What did you think of Clara's transformation and her path to true love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're craving more tales of love, courage, and personal growth, be sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.